And so if we don't do that, then what happens is the mind kind of drifts with these thoughts, and we're not so aware of that. And then those thoughts build up this momentum to what is described in the Buddhist teachings as an obsessive force. And I can quite relate to that because I've had a difficulty catching things early. To me, things were like pretty far down the road. What I was working with were like civil wars in my mind. And when you catch these things early, they don't have the feeling of a civil war. I know that because I've listened to other people. Wasn't having that experience, but I've listened to many people in this room about this, and I know that as you catch things earlier, they're much easier to deal with. So this is what happens when we're not aware, or when we're kind of drifting with things, still some awareness but not really tuned into it, that they can build up this momentum. So when they get to that point, this original way that we're working with our meditation, where we're lightly noticing things and bringing our mind back to the object of meditation, that actually won't work when the force is too great. And that's been my experience, which is why I guess I like this sutra so much. It helps me to understand what I've maybe wallowed through to get to some experiential other understanding of. So basically, that's kind of how our mind works. So what I would say is more happening in meditation is that we work to become aware of the contents of our mind, and then we make choices about what we're going to do with our mind. Now, we don't have perfect control, in fact we have some control. And so that's where this comes in, these 5 methods. And the first one is this giving attention to some other sign, which in this context means object, which is connected with what is wholesome. And this is something we're all quite familiar with in our tradition of, say, if you become aware that you're having anger in the mind, you try to bring to mind loving kindness, because the two can't coexist. So when the thoughts are kind of obsessive and you recognize that, then you can go to this method, because it's difficult just to say, I'm not going to think this, and bring your mind back to what your object of meditation is. It has a force that you can't always overcome. So that's why we have these 5 methods to look at. So what we're trying to do with this first one is we're trying to replace what is actually an unwholesome thought with a wholesome thought. And then the way that it was described in this sutra is this. Here, monks, when a monk is giving attention to some sign, owing to that sign, there arises in him unwholesome thoughts connected with desire, with hate, with delusion. He should give attention to some other sign connected with what is wholesome. When he gives attention to some other sign connected with what is wholesome, then any unwholesome thoughts connected with desire, with hate, with delusion are abandoned in him and subside. With the abandoning of them, his mind becomes steadied internally, quieted, brought to singleness, and concentrated. And here's the simile. Just as a skillful carpenter or his apprentice might knock out, remove, and extract a coarse peg by means of a fine one, so too, when a monk gives attention to some other sign connected with what is wholesome, his mind becomes steadied internally, quieted, brought to singleness, and concentrated. So it's this idea of, and I kind of have that come up in my meditation sometimes, like I've got this thing going on in my mind, I've just got to boom, put this good thought in there and knock the old one out. And so that can become kind of difficult to recognize sometimes what's wholesome and unwholesome, I think, though. And that's, I think, where we become more refined. We have to learn how to more examine our thoughts a little bit more, than to identify what those thoughts really are. Is this desire? Is this doubt? Is this restlessness? Is this ill will? Is this sloth? I mean, there's many things to choose from, but we're going to kind of focus on 3 to 5. And then recognize that what's arising is actually unwholesome, because that hasn't always been the case in my mind. Sometimes, especially with doubt and remorse, both of those, I thought these were actually pretty good ways to be spending my time, you know, in some way, shape, or form. And I understood this more clearly from reading a book about self-esteem, where they said, yeah, maybe once every 250 times you do this, you come up with a good solution. But look how much time you've wasted, you know. And I think that kind of mind that churns is, you know, oftentimes doesn't lead us to much useful conclusions. So I think that's kind of why this is the first method, because it helps us to start looking at what the contents are of our mind. And then the next part of the sutra, they go into pretty much the 5 hindrances, although they narrow them down a little bit to 3. But we'll just talk about them briefly next time, focusing a little bit on the different ones. So that's kind of the simile. So sometimes when you're doing your meditation then, and you find that things are coming up in your mind, just I actually have the visual of, like, you know, okay, I'm going to knock this one out, pop that peg out, replace it with something good. So hopefully this will all add up to something helpful for your practice.